I was left on clinic duty again last night, which made me very upset as these situations have been happening all too often lately. It was due to the urgent illness of two of my colleagues, and I had to take over their duties. It was a busy shift, although the overtime pay was good, but I would have preferred to be at home in my own bed. As I walked down the long corridors of the clinic, the large ceiling lamps had just switched to night lighting. The hallway smelled of disinfectants and sterility, which is usually unpleasant, but to me, a nurse, the smell was familiar. That night, however, I thought the odor was stronger. After changing, I went into one of the rooms and sat down in the duty chair. Turning the chair toward the window, I watched the sun slowly recede over the horizon, leaving a beautiful shade of red in the sky. I had a cup of hot coffee in my hand, which I sipped confidently. I was soon joined by my coworker. After that, the work began. The shift change went quickly, as usual. One patient gradually recovered, another was given an infusion, and one died of a viral infection. Such is life in a hospital where people come and go. I never worried about patients dying, but my colleagues often didn't have time to take the bodies to the morgue located in the basement. Even on such unpleasant nights, I had to carry the bodies. My coworkers wished me a peaceful shift, and I set out on my first patrol. Most of the patients were lying in their beds, watching TV or reading books. Some of them had already fallen asleep. I gave a few infusions and helped an elderly woman go to the bathroom. After that, I went back to the on-call room, poured myself a cup of coffee, and looked out the window. There was only a faint light on the horizon. Night was falling. I finally decided to take a break for a smoke and headed for the back door leading outside. Walking through the basement, I passed the room with the bunk and stepped outside. The cool night air enveloped me, and I enjoyed having a smoke. My gaze fell on the glass door that led to the corridor at the end of which was the morgue, and then I remembered that I still had to carry the dead man there. Quickly finishing my cigarette, I walked back to the ward and entered room 018, holding a cigarette and a cup of coffee. The ward was locked, which is quite normal when there is a deceased patient in it. I looked for my key, and the moment I saw a woman cowering on the floor down the hall, the key fell out of my hands and jingled on the floor. Bending down to pick it up, I looked in the direction where the woman had been before, but there was only emptiness. It was probably a patient suffering from Parkinson's disease, which explained his unhealthy posture. I opened the door and entered the room, which had no illumination other than the dim light falling through the crack in the door. There was a bed against the wall, on which I could see the outline of a corpse lying on it. I covered it with a sheet and went to the morgue. In front of the duty room, I paused to attach the black bracelet to the dead man's wrist, with which all bodies are marked. When I pulled back the sheet a little to look at the man's face, I saw that he looked old, but not too old. About 60 years old, gray hair, sunken cheeks, and a stubbly beard. I covered him up again and headed for the elevator. Suddenly I heard footsteps behind me. When I looked back, I saw a young man walking down the hallway. He was dressed similarly to the previous woman and had an unhealthy posture. His face was as pale as the woman's. The elevator doors opened, and I dragged the bed inside. Then I pressed the button to exit to the basement. As the doors closed, I pondered this young man's strange peculiarity, but I couldn't determine what it was that confused me. Once in the basement, I moved the bed to the morgue and put the key in the lock, but to my surprise, the door was not locked. Apparently someone had forgotten to do so. The light in the hallway suddenly turned on, and it was so bright that I squeezed my eyes shut for a moment. The basement morgue shouldn't have been lit at night, since hardly anyone ever came in here, or if they did, it was only for a short time. As my eyes adjusted to the brightness, I could make out movement at the end of the hallway, but I could only vaguely make out something in the bright light. After a moment, the room was empty. At that moment, I had the thought that I might be going crazy. I loaded the man's body onto the bar and slid it into one of the refrigerated chambers. The other chambers appeared to be open, and I peered into them, but they too were empty. I guess it's an open house, I jokingly thought, trying to reassure myself. I left the morgue and headed for the elevator, intending to return to the on-call room. Suddenly I heard a rustling, louder than before. I looked around, but instead of this man, who may have gotten lost in the corridors due to dementia, there was an elderly man standing in front of me. He stood quite close, and his face was pale, the same as the previous woman's. He looked me straight in the eyes, and I felt intense fear. My heart pounding frantically, I took step by step out of the room, keeping my eyes on the man who was silently staring at me. Then, deciding to turn around, I rushed forward, running down the hallway toward the elevator. The elevator doors barely had time to close, and at the last moment I jumped inside. The young woman, who was already in the elevator, looked at me confusedly. I was out of breath, and she asked me what was wrong. I tried to explain that there was a dead person in there. She just looked at me confused and said that dead people can't walk. She asked how I knew it was a dead person. Breathing heavily, I explained to her that I had taken the body to the morgue myself just half an hour ago, and there was a black bracelet on his wrist. It suddenly dawned on me why the patients were so strange and pale, and why they wore black bracelets. These bracelets were used to mark the dead. I froze for a second, but the elevator kept going up, seemingly with no intention of stopping. Panic spread across my face as I stared at the wrist of the woman sitting next to me and saw her black bracelet.